Dan Perry is the former chief of the Associated Press in Europe, Africa and Middle East. He's joining us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. It does seem to those of us looking from the outside that there appears to be a greater amount of pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu, not only from international governments, but also from, in some cases, the families of captives who just want the captives to be released from Hamas. How close do you think we are to Netanyahu authorizing another ceasefire or another deal to get those captives released?
Well, it really depends on the terms. I mean, look, the families have become a pressure group aiming to compel the government to do just what you say, to halt the war even temporarily, to make sure that they leave no stone unturned and so forth. And that pressure has increased in the past 2 days in an effort to leverage the shock of the public in general at the killing of the 3 hostages mistakenly. Now, look, the government argues that it's precisely pressure on Hamas, continued military pressure, that will bring them to give up the hostages. The families are extremely skeptical about this, but to a degree, I think it misses the point because talks are going on, in effect, all the time. And I think we know what Hamas wants, which is a deal that releases all the Palestinian prisoners in Israel and ends the war with Hamas left in charge in Gaza. And when it becomes clear to the Israeli public that this is the deal, when the talks become more known of and when this is discussed more robustly, I'm not so sure that they'd support it. Because as your reporter said, there's pretty close to consensus in a normally quite divided country that after October 7th, Hamas must be removed at almost any cost.
And that is the clearly stated goal from Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition, and of course the Israeli military as well. But we have seen this dichotomy, if you like, between that particular goal and the provable attainment of that goal against the number of people in Gaza, the number of civilians who are caught up in this and who are dying. 18,800, I think, was the last number that I saw. It is a very difficult situation, one would imagine, for the Israeli government to get itself out of. Is there a way that you have, given your experience in the region, that you can see from a historical perspective, that they might be able to change the dynamic in this and actually change the course of the conflict?
You're absolutely right that it's just hugely complex and kind of excruciating. And, you know, one can be cynical about governments and political players. Not everyone in the region is a fan of Israel, but I don't think too many would trade places. It's possible that the only way out of this will involve other players and more creative solutions. For example, I can envision Israel agreeing to a Beirut 1982 scenario in which the Hamas leadership is given amnesty and allowed to leave. Who knows, maybe to Qatar, maybe to Turkey. I also think it would go a long way towards mollifying the Israelis and their post-October 7th shock if Saudi Arabia, and again, maybe Qatar, would join the Abraham Accords and agree to take part in the post-war reconstruction and administration of Gaza. But what viewers around the world, and especially the Arab world, really should understand is that October 7th for Israelis was a watershed of a kind that just shut down the discussion on the acceptability of Hamas. And if you minimize it or somehow deny the scale of what happened, you're going to be confused by Israel's behavior.
I want to talk to you briefly about the level of international support that has been given so far to the Netanyahu coalition in this. We have been reporting over the last couple of weeks that there appears to be, again, for those of us looking up from the outside, some sort of divergence, if you like, between the US, the UK, various other governments, and the Netanyahu government. They all say that they support Israel's right to defend itself. But there seems to be a direction against Benjamin Netanyahu and the coalition itself. Is there a split that you see happening in the way that the international governments, are viewing this?
Absolutely. I mean, there is a clear and profound misalignment between the government currently in power in the US and also most European governments and the nature of the original Netanyahu coalition until it was expanded to include a moderate party post-October 7th. I mean, this is an extremely right-wing party, right-wing coalition in Israel that projected a lot of weakness and created huge divisions in Israel by allowing radical settlers to run riot in the West Bank. I'm sure you know, most of the army was in the West Bank precisely because of that self-inflicted disaster and not guarding the border in Gaza on October 7th. The government of Israel as such is not beloved of the Joe Biden White House. That is not to say that they don't agree that Israel should remove Hamas from power. So there's these multiple narratives. They would like Israel to do it more cleanly and to do it more quickly. And of course, there are political considerations in the U.S. for President Biden, who, by the way, faces a swing state with a significant Muslim population in Michigan that he can't afford to lose in 2024. He needs this war to end reasonably well for the U.S. and for Israel, and to end somewhat quickly. And Netanyahu, meanwhile, he has his own political context. His interests align with the prolonged conflict because his brand has been so devastated by the colossal failure on October 7th that if elections were held today, he would be crushed. And therefore, he is looking for a new ticket to run on, and I fear that ticket will be in opposition to what is precisely the U.S. plan and what I believe would be the Arab League plan for post-Hamas Gaza, which is for the PA to be returned in a rejuvenated, reinvigorated status and nature to Gaza.
I want to get your assessment of what Israelis themselves would regard as being able to draw a line under the situation, for want of a better phrase, what they would find acceptable once this conflict is over.
I think Israelis have two contradictory notions currently competing for dominance in their collective mind. One is, it seems to be hopeless, this idea of a common country with the Palestinians. They want partition. But the other is, they don't trust the Palestinians to prevent their jihadi radicals from taking over any territory that the Israelis concede. And therefore, I think, well, I know the polls show currently that the centrist and moderate and left-wing alternative coalition in Israel would probably win an election. But to do that, they need to succeed in actually getting elected, not just in the polls, but in an election. They can't talk too much about conceding land to the Palestinians, because if Israel hands over the West Bank the way it handed over Gaza in 2005 and 6 to the PA, Israelis fear that the result would be within a year or two, radicals taking over the West Bank, and West Bank comes within 25, 30 miles of Tel Aviv and surrounds Jerusalem on three sides. Now, can you imagine an invasion of the sort that happened just across the border of Gaza on October 7th happening again in 2 or 3 years, but this time in Jerusalem? It will be a bloodbath. And that is not an illogical, that's not an irrational fear, that's not paranoia. That's an issue that has to be somehow addressed, which is why I say this is bigger than Israel and the Palestinians. It's so potentially cataclysmically disastrous that I think the Arab League and Saudi Arabia and Qatar has a role to play as well, really need to step in and help the sides come up with creative solutions. And I suspect that the Israelis would receive very well, in addition to Saudi Arabia and others joining the Abraham Accords, being willing to send a multinational Arab force to a place like Gaza to help police it in the transition to an independent Palestinian state. They are willing, I think, the Israelis are, to contemplate a two-state solution if their security is somehow guaranteed. I think October 7th compels even Israel's rivals in the region, even cynics, to accept that the security thing is not a paranoid delusion, but something real that needs to be addressed.
Dan Perry, former chief of Associated Press in Europe, Africa and Middle East. We appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.